Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is our YouTube series on how to improve your chess. One of the things I would like to emphasize in the series is amateur games. And the reason I like to do that is if you go on YouTube, you can find trillions of master games, and these are extremely good to go over and to study and so on. What I don't understand is anyone who would say you should only study Grandmaster games, because they're very helpful because they're going to tell you what you should be doing. But just like you should study your own games, you can learn a lot from having a good player go over an amateur game and talk about their mistakes, how you could avoid the same mistakes, how you can take advantage of your opponents who make those mistakes. And you don't see those kind of things in Grandmaster games because unless they're in like great time trouble, they're usually not making the kind of mistakes that amateurs make. And it doesn't help you learn how to take advantage of it or how to avoid it. So I greatly agree that the Grandmaster games are extremely helpful. What I don't understand is people who would think that watching amateur games is not. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier videos, when we say the word amateur, we mean below master. We don't mean, beginner. So I have an amateur game that someone sent me today, and let's set it up here, and let's see what we can learn from it. All right, so white played e4, black played e5, white played knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ruy Lopez, and black plays what's called the classical variation, bishop c5. So the main idea here is to play c3 and d4, and you've got 3 white pieces guarding d4 and only 3 black pieces defending it, which means that you'll be able to maintain a pawn on d4 and the bishop on c5 will have to move. And the computer says that playing c3 right away is the most accurate, because if you play castle first, which looks very reasonable, then black has the interesting line knight to d4, hitting the bishop on b5, and the computer thinks that black is getting close to equality. But if white had played c3 instead first, and then played either d4 or maybe castles, then he's going to get what he wants out of the opening, which is a reasonable advantage. All right, so white castles. Black plays knight ge7, I believe, which is a rare line. The idea is to take back on c6 with the knight on e7 to guard the e5 pawn. White correctly plays c3, intending d4. And now black should maybe counter with something like d5 or bishop b6. He plays a6. And the computer's refutation of a6 is very interesting. And since it wasn't played in the game, let's take a look at what white should have done. What he could have done is taken the knight. Now this gives up a tempo, and it doesn't double the pawns, but it gives up the bishop pair and doesn't double the pawns. But what it does is it'll gain a tempo to attack that knight. So now when black trades off here, if he saves the bishop, then white can play d5. And on knight e7, he can play d6, cutting the black army in half, basically. And it's very instructive on what happens here. On pawn takes, rather than taking with the queen and letting the bishop attack it, the computer just wants to guard the d5 square with like knight c3. And then when black plays something like b5, you could take the pawn now, or you could play bishop f4 to get the pawn back. And white has a nice little advantage here. Okay. d6, c takes d6. And knight c3 seems to be about as good as anything. All right, so let's go back to the game. So in the game, white plays the natural move bishop to a4. And black should probably play b5 here. He plays castle, and again, the castling gives white a chance to push this pawn up the board. Pawn takes, bishop back. Now this is the game, and what white should play is d5. So there's a good general rule to follow here. If you're not sure whether you should play d5, and that is if the knight can go to a good square and maintain that square, then you probably have to be careful about doing this because you're weakening your dark squares here in the center. But in this case, the knight has to retreat. And not only is the retreat losing time, but it gives white a chance to play the same kind of idea, d6, pawn takes, and then maybe either queen takes d6 now since there's no bishop to b8, or just knight c3 clamping down on that pawn. And white has a big advantage here. So that's something that amateurs let you do a lot. You know, push these pawns up in the middle and really get a big advantage. So if your opponent's letting you do that, take advantage of it. Knock those pieces out of the middle. Here, white is intent on following good opening principles by getting all his pieces out. And by the way, moving the pawn up, which is an AWL move, attack with something worth less, is not really violating the principle of moving pieces twice before you move any piece once, because first of all, it's not only an AWL move winning a tempo, it's not wasting any time, because your pawn move has to make the knight move, so you're not losing time to where he's getting more and more pieces out, which is one of the main reasons you need to get your pieces out, is if you don't, your opponent will, and here he can't. All right, so back to the game. So white plays knight c3, still threatening like d5, d6, and black should stop that with a move like d5, instantly kind of equalizing the center. Black plays d6, which is okay. Not quite as good as d5, but you know, at least now white can't play d5, d6. All right, white plays h3. In this particular position, h3 is a very reasonable move because it's the bishop's only good square. The bishop goes to e6, white can fork him with d5, and bishop d7 kind of cramps black's position a little bit. So playing h3 is okay. And black says, well, I'd love to get out that bishop, but that's my only square left, so I'll play bishop d7. And white plays rook e1. White has obviously a very nice advantage. He's played the Roy Lopez in such a way that he's recaptured in the center with the pawns. So he's got these two wonderful pawns controlling the central squares, and black has just this pawn on d6. Much easier to play white's position here. So black plays knight to g6. White develops the bishop with e3. Good idea. White's just trying to get his pieces out. And now black should play maybe knight a5, going into the square and trying to trade off. He could also obviously play something like rook e8. The computer says knight c7 is a move as well. He plays h6. This is a very strange move. The idea of h6 would be to prevent a move like bishop to g5, but white's not going to play bishop to g5. Maybe he's worried about knight g5 followed by queen h5. But if white plays knight g5, let's say black does nothing here. Let's say he plays rook e8 and white plays knight g5. Well, now you can play h6. It makes a lot more sense to play it when there's a knight there and forcing the knight to go back, thus losing a tempo for white because he moved the knight twice and you only move the pawn once, than it would be to move the pawn once to prevent the knight from going there when the knight going there doesn't really do anything. I see this kind of amateur mistake a lot. So you don't want to just push up your pawns to prevent your people from going to squares. Notice this game is a good example where black's h6 is a very weakening move, while white's h3 was not. And learning when these pawn moves are reasonable and when they're not is a good part of becoming a better player, because if you just think, oh, I'll randomly play that, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, that's not so good. It's good to analyze with good players and try to figure out when these things really work. Okay, so white plays queen to d2, and now white has, in some lines, the threat to play bishop takes h6, and if he takes back with the pawn, you take with the queen, and then you play knight to g5, threatening a mating attack. So black has to be very careful now to avoid these kind of things. The computer says he should either play knight to a5, threatening to fork the queen and the bishop, or king to h7 to guard that h6 square and stop the funny business. Instead, black plays knight ce7. And now the question is, should white trade bishops or should he save the bishop? Well, it turns out this pawn is pretty loose and this diagonal is pretty strong. So bringing the bishop back to b3 or c2 is actually pretty close, and they're both pretty good. The computer says actually if white plays perfectly with both those moves, he should be, pretty much winning. So white decides to play bishop c2, and that helps the sacrifice because it puts another piece potentially on that square with the move e5. All right, so black has to be very careful here what he does, because bishop h6 is going to come up very soon. He plays c6, and that doesn't do it. He could have played a move like queen c8 to try to guard white squares. So let's see why c6 doesn't work. Bishop takes h6. If he takes it, queen h6. All right, so the threat is knight g5, followed by checkmate. How does black stop that? Well, if he plays f6, white can play bishop b3 check. If black now plays d5, white simply takes that pawn, and white has too many pieces on e7 and d5, and black's position is completely falling apart here. And of course, if he plays rook f7, if white wants, he can just take that rook, although you don't usually just take pin pieces, but here you get this queen check. Things are looking really bad. King e8, e5, blasting open the center with the king there. Computer says white's completely winning here. Big attack. All right, so back to the game. So white probably doesn't see enough to think that he's getting more than the 2 pawns. Anytime you can get the 2 pawns for the piece and open up the king, it's certainly a worthwhile consideration. Sometimes it's really good. Like if, for instance, if here black could play queen to f6 and queen g7, maybe it wouldn't work at all. And it's a good idea to work out when it works and when it doesn't. Go through the game with the engine, go through with a good player, and get a feel for when these kind of things might work and when they don't. If you're not sure and you're playing a game that's not, at the World Open for $10,000, and you have a choice between playing a move that's equal or a move that's speculative, play the speculative move so you can learn something. Now in this position, it's not really a decision between equal and speculative, because white has a good game. So here, white would not play speculative if he's not sure, because he has a good game anyway. Why throw away a good game for a speculative game? But if you have an equal game, throwing it away for a speculative game, and in the sense throwing away isn't even the right term, is not such a bad idea if it's equal. All right, so here white just develops his rook, and he's done a pretty good job of getting all his pieces in the game. White's pieces are kind of nice, and the fact that he doesn't have a pawn on c2 means his pieces have, a little bit more space than they would if there was a pawn on c2 here. Then he'd be a little bit cramped. Okay, so black plays bishop e6, and for quite a few moves now, bishop h6 will be on. For instance, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, threatening knight g5. If he plays f6 again, you play e5, hitting that knight twice. And black's really in big trouble here. If he moves that knight, like knight h8, then queen h7 is mate. And he has no way, if he plays king f7 to guard it, you have a million ways to play in this position. You could play bishop takes, knight takes, queen check to remove the guard. Or you can just play pawn takes pawn, hitting the other knight. If he plays king takes, knight g5, hitting the bishop, threatening the check. And he's also threatening this check. He's got a million ways to win this position. Okay, so white doesn't see that, of course. Once you miss it once, sometimes it's hard to see it after the first time. So queen to c1, d5. Okay, so in these kind of positions, generally you want to play e5 and create a 4-on-3 majority, where later you can move your knight out of the way and push this pawn to f4 and f5. Now, what's interesting in this position is the best move is bishop takes h6 for reasons obviously we already talked about. The second best move by the computer is to actually take the pawn, which is very interesting. Normally you wouldn't do that. It would isolate your pawn and give him the d5 square for his pieces. So this is quite the exception to the rule. If I was playing a speed game here, I would hardly even look at e takes d5. Now I realize that e takes d5 opens this line, but so does e5. So I wouldn't realize that this was an exception. So let's take a look at that. E takes d5. If black takes with the knight, then bishop h6 is strong, but white could also play something like bishop takes g6 to remove the guard on the bishop, and now when he plays bishop h6, the bishop is hanging. So black would therefore take with the bishop, and this is actually what happened in the game. White did take the pawn, which is not as big a mistake as it normally is. It looks wrong. And black took with the bishop, and now white's best move is to play knight e5 and start getting rid of some of these defenders on the king side. Instead, he decides to go for the bishop pair with knight takes d5, and the computer really doesn't like that move and thinks that now if black recaptures with the knight, that white's advantage is very minimal. But instead, he takes with the queen. Taking with the queen, unfortunately, allows bishop takes again. Why? Because if you play bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes here. Oh, maybe he shouldn't take queen takes. Oh, he should play rook takes e7 first. Sorry. Rook takes e7. If the knight takes, now queen h6, threatening mate. And if he plays knight f5, queen h5, threatening the knight and threatening knight g5. And even though white's down a rook, he's got a winning attack here. The computer says +8. On the other hand, if you take with a knight and white plays bishop h6, pawn takes, queen takes, now instead of having the black queen on d5, he's on d8, which means he has access to the dark squares. He plays queen f6 with the idea of guarding, for instance, knight g5, simply queen g7. And not only does white have not enough compensation for the sacrifice, he's actually probably just losing here. So that makes all the difference in the world. Black takes with the queen, and now again white could play bishop h6. But bishop h6, as I've said already, once you miss it, it's very unlikely you're going to find it later. Okay, so white plays bishop b3, hitting the queen. Queen moves back to d7. Stockfish doesn't like that, suggests queen h5, guarding the king side is better. Not surprisingly, it now says, oh, if he goes queen d7, we can play bishop h6. But we know that white doesn't see that, so let's see what he does. He plays the second best move. If he doesn't play bishop h6, knight e5 is a good move, intending to open up lines in the center and get rid of some of those defenders. Black moves the queen, and not surprisingly, bishop takes h6 is still the best move. Let's take a look. Bishop h6. If he takes, knight takes g6. If knight takes g6, queen takes h6, threatening queen takes g6 with a sneaky pin. So black has to stop that. In order to stop that, he needs to move the knight. So let's say he moves the knight to f4. Now white just wants to make a rook, what's called a rook lift. He wants to get the rook up and over for a mate. So almost every rook lift wins here. He could attack the knight and threaten rook g4. He can go in front of the knight and threaten rook g5. And in fact, after rook e5, the computer says black's best move is queen takes e5. And of course, white's just winning. All right, so back to the game. In the game, white does not play bishop h6. He plays bishop back to b3, c2, I mean, which really is not that great a move because taking twice on g6 doesn't work here. But bishop takes h6 would not work anymore once he takes with the f-pawn because the queen could come over and defend. So black takes the pawn, white takes back, and now of course black cannot play queen takes e5. I think most players would understand why. If you don't know, you can stop the video and I'll explain. Well, the answer is if queen takes e5, it's not bishop h6 that's so strong. It's bishop takes a7. Taking a piece on a7 and attacking the queen, and white's just winning material with a discovered attack. So black sees this, of course, and he plays bishop takes e3. And white takes with the rook to guard his pawn on e5. And black plays knight d5. That looks like a reasonable move, hitting the rook, but actually that allows a tactic too. So again, if you would like to take the quiz, stop the video, see if you can find the tactic. This is the kind of tactic that could be subject to a quiescence error. You could say, oh, I can't take that knight with the rook because he'll just take back with the pawn, and then I lose a rook for a knight, and that's not good. But if you look one move further for your checks, captures, and threats, if you take that knight, rook takes d5, if black does take back, then bishop h7 check wins the queen. Discovered attack. So knight d5 from e7 is completely unsafe. White should just say, what happens if I take that knight? That's one of the big ways to avoid quiescence errors. Rather than saying, if I take that knight and he takes back, I lose the exchange, you should say, if I take that knight and he takes back, are there any further checks, captures, or threats that make it worth considering? And the answer is yes, your only check wins the game. So you don't want to say, I take, he takes, I'm behind. You want to say, I take, he takes, so far I'm behind, are there further checks, captures, or threats that would make it worth investigating? If the answer is no, then don't play it. If the answer is yes, then it's usually worth your time to keep investigating to see if it works. That way you avoid quiescence errors. And I've gone over many games like this with students, and they almost all say that they stop and make quiescence errors. When I ask why they miss these things, the answer is almost always quiescence errors. So if you're a class player, and most people watching this probably are, don't say, oh, if I play rook takes d5, e takes d5, I lose the exchange. Say, if I play rook takes d5, e takes d5, and give up that material, are there more checks, captures, or threats that make it worth looking for? And the answer is yes. Now, of course, it takes some board vision to see this nice diagonal move over here as a check. You might miss that too. So it takes a combination of good thought process to avoid the quiescence error, as well as the board vision to see that bishop h7 would win the queen. So white plays rook to g3 with the idea that he's threatening the sneaky pin, queen takes h6. So here black should stop the sneaky pin. He should play king to h8 so that queen h6 just loses the queen. Instead, he decides to trade pawns, or maybe he didn't see the sneaky pin. He plays queen takes e5 and allows white to play queen takes h6. Okay, well, the good news for black is that his queen on e5 is guarding the mate on g7. The bad news is the bishop is guarding h7, so there's a mate on queen h7 now. So black has to stop the mate, and there's only one good way to stop it. See if you can look at the board and figure out what black should do. Well, okay. He can't play queen g3 to remove the guard on the queen because queen h7 is mate, so that move is out. If he moves the rook, there's a cute combination. Queen check, king f8, rook e3, and now the queen can't move because queen h8 is mate, so he has to take the rook. And now white has the cute move rook d7, threatening mate. And there's nothing black can do. If he plays g6 to guard h8, then queen takes f7 or rook takes f7 is mate. That's not easy to see, but it is cute. All right, so the only move that black has, oh, and if he plays knight f6, of course, queen takes g7 is now mate again, so he can't do that. So the only move to stop the mate is f5 to block the bishop from guarding the h6 square. Clearly, you can't play f6 because queen takes g7 is mate again. So f5 is black's only move here. And black probably only saw the sneaky pin idea, and he forgot that white is opening up a second line. So black completely misses the second idea here. We call these squares focal points. Vukovic wrote a book called The Art of Attack, and he talks about focal points. And as soon as you play queen h6, the first focal point becomes g7 because the rook was attacking that pawn and it was pinned and it couldn't take the queen. But here there's two focal points. You also have to look at what's happening on h7. And I think what happened to black is that after queen h6, he saw his queen was guarding the mate. He saw he couldn't take the queen, but he forgot to look for the other focal point. And he just plays queen takes b2. And amazingly enough, what happened to black also must have happened to white. Because when I first played over this game, I said, really? Did I write down the moves wrong? Did both players miss something? And the answer is yes. White also doesn't see that he has a second focal point. He completely concentrating on this G7 focal point. So instead, he decides to skewer the queen and try to win back his pawn that he sacrificed. So instead of playing queen h7 mate, he plays rook to b1. Black plays back queen f6, and now again white needs to focus on that focal point. No pun intended. But white says, oh good, I can win this pawn on b7. All I have to do is trade queens and take the pawn. So this is a case of when you see a good move, look for a better one. You can win a pawn or you can checkmate your opponent. White sees he can win a pawn, and he does play queen f6, knight f6, rook takes b7, and the smoke is cleared, and now white just has an advantage instead of checkmating. Black should probably get his rooks in the game. He plays knight d5. White plays bishop e4. Now black decides to guard the c-pawn with... Notice black's rooks are fairly passive here. White plays rook f3, threatening the pawn on f7. Black guards it there, but that gives up a pawn. So maybe better is to just play knight f6 because the rook's guarding the pawn. When he plays rook c7, white has a simple combination. He just trades off and takes the pawn. Rook takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and now white's up 4 pawns to 3 with... And now the bishop's better than the knight. There's pawns on both sides of the board. So white has multiple advantages here. He's got the better minor piece, and he's got an extra potential passed pawn. What he should do is push up the h-pawn and eventually create a passed pawn, but he needs his king to help there. So black plays rook a7, white plays rook d3, black plays knight e6, white plays bishop there. White should get his king into the game. Knight c5 hits the rook. White saves the rook. Black moves the knight back. White attacks the pawn on f7, but this is easily guarded. I guess white's starting to get a little low on time, and he's just making the first reasonable move he sees. But in order to win this game, you have to get your king in the game, and you got to get your pawns rolling. You got to get your majority going. So knight f6, bishop back, a5. White decides to play a4, king f8. Rook e3 to cut off the king. Knight d7. King f1. And here black offers a draw to white. Now, we don't have the time stamping for the game, but I think at this point black had 12 minutes left in the game, and white had only 5 or 6 with a small increment. So white, there's also an extenuating circumstance here, which is white is a handicapped person, and he can't move his pieces really fast. And when he gets low on time, unlike most of us who just panic, he has better reason to be concerned. So, the average person, can play fast if they learn how to do that. It's not so easy for white in this position to do that. But if he were a strong player here, he would never, ever, ever, ever give his opponent a draw. Especially if he has any kind of time delay or increment. He would get the king in the game, push the kingside pawns up the board, try to create a passed pawn, and white has every possibility of winning here. The computer says if black plays perfectly, the game is right on the verge of whether it's winnable for white or not. But my guess is that if the computer could see even further, that it probably is a really good chance for white to win here. Okay, so this was a very instructive game. We saw a lot of missed tactics. We saw quiescence errors. We saw speculative sacrifices that would have worked. We saw both sides focusing on the wrong focal point and both missing a mate. You might say to yourself, oh, I would never do those things. And the answer is, okay, maybe you're much better than these players and you might not. But on the other hand, there's some aspects of their errors that I've seen much stronger players than they are make those same errors. And these were players that were good enough. White was good enough. He knew that against bishop c5 in the opening, he should play c3 and d4. He knew about developing all his pieces. These were players that didn't just play like beginners. They were players. I know White's an experienced tournament player. So these are people that are kind of typical amateur players. And yes, they're not, expert level amateur players, but a lot of the mistakes they made and a lot of things you could do to take advantage of them are things that you'll see in a lot of players' games of stronger caliber. Okay, for our YouTube series, hopefully you enjoyed our third amateur game. And if you like it, my website is Dan Heisman my website is danheisman.com. If you're interested in lessons or anything like that, just go to danheisman.com and send me an email, or I'm always glad to answer questions on Skype or on my home phone even. Home phone, Skype, it doesn't make any difference. In both cases, I'm picking up a headset and putting it on. So, I'm always glad to help people out. My full-time job is to give chess lessons, and hopefully you enjoy these videos and get something out of them. See you next time. Thank you. Bye.